I walked down the aisle to marry my fiance and found his twin brother waiting at the altar. 7 years together, we built everything slowly. First apartment with the broken radiator, his law school graduation where his mother cried, my promotion to marketing director, Sunday breakfast at the place with terrible pancakes but perfect orange juice. He knew I hated surprises and loved routine. I knew he couldn't sleep without checking the door was locked twice. We fit together like that. The proposal happened at his parents' anniversary dinner. 30 family members watching as he dropped to one knee. "Will you marry me?" he asked, and his hands weren't shaking like I thought they would. That should have been my first sign. Colin's hands always shook when he was nervous, but I was too happy to notice. Said yes while his mother shrieked and his father ordered champagne. His twin brother Christopher stood in the corner, raising his glass with everyone else, that satisfied smile on his face. They weren't identical, not exactly. Christopher was broader, his jaw sharper, but in the right light you could mistake them. 2 months before the wedding, Colin seemed different. He forgot our Thursday takeout tradition twice. "Just work stress," he said, but he was actually working less, coming home earlier. When I mentioned it, he changed the subject to wedding plans. The rehearsal dinner was at his parents' country club. Colin gave a speech about destiny and soulmates, words he'd never used before. He was a practical man who believed in tax benefits and shared health insurance, not destiny. But everyone clapped and his mother dabbed her eyes and I told myself people change for weddings. Christopher kept watching from the head table, leaning forward every time Colin touched me, studying us like we were a movie he was memorizing. During the rehearsal itself, Colin kissed me differently, his hand on my cheek instead of my waist where it always went. "Save something for tomorrow," the priest joked, and everyone laughed. Christopher stood as best man, positioned where he could see everything, and when I caught him looking, he didn't look away, just smiled like he knew something. "You okay?" I asked Colin. "Perfect," he said. My bridesmaids fussed with my hair while I stared at my phone. Colin had texted "can't wait" at midnight. Just that. No emoji, no nickname, no love you at the end. He always ended with love you, even grocery lists. My sister asked if I was nervous. I said yes, but meant something else. Walking to the church doors, my father squeezing my arm, I saw Colin at the altar. His boutonniere was pinned to the right side. We'd specifically discussed left side because his grandfather always wore it left. The wedding coordinator had noted it 3 times. But there he stood, flower on the right, hands clasped in front instead of behind like he always stood when waiting. The stance was wrong. Too relaxed. Too confident. The music started. Everyone stood. I walked forward and with each step, small things jumped out. His tie was knotted different, fuller, the way Christopher tied his. His hair parted on the wrong side. His smile too wide, showing too many teeth. Colin had a reserved smile, contained. This smile was Christopher's smile. 20 steps from the altar I knew with absolute certainty. This wasn't Colin standing there. This was Christopher wearing Colin's tuxedo, Colin's ring, Colin's place. He wasn't nervous or uncertain. He stood like he belonged there, like he'd practiced this moment. I kept walking. Christopher watched me approach. The groomsmen were all Christopher's friends, I realized suddenly. We reached the altar. My father kissed my cheek, placed my hand in Christopher's. His palm was dry, steady. Colin's were always slightly clammy when emotional. Christopher's were never. The priest began talking about love and commitment while my mind raced. Christopher leaned closer than Colin would, his cologne different, stronger. His mother was crying in the front row, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the door like waiting for something. His father kept checking his phone. Christopher whispered during the prayer, "You look beautiful." Colin would never interrupt the prayer, never break protocol like that, but Christopher would. Christopher, who'd always stood too close at family dinners, who remembered my birthday when Colin forgot, who brought me coffee exactly how I liked it whenever he visited Colin at our apartment. The priest asked about objections. Silence. Christopher's thumb stroked my hand, a gesture Colin never did. Deliberate, claiming. Then the priest turned to Christopher. "Do you, Colin, take this woman?" "I do." Like he'd been waiting to say it. My turn. The priest smiled at me. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Christopher's hand held mine steady. His mother had stopped crying. His father put away his phone. The priest waited. Everyone waited. Christopher's eyes met mine, patient and sure, like he knew what I'd say before I did. "Yes, father." The priest raised his hands and smiled at us both. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Christopher pulled me close before I could react, his hand cupping the back of my neck in a way Colin never did, fingers pressing into my hair. The kiss lasted too long, his mouth moving against mine with an ownership that made my stomach turn. Everyone clapped and cheered while I stood there frozen, my brain screaming that this was wrong, that I just married the wrong man, that everyone was celebrating a lie. Christopher took my arm and we turned to face the crowd, and I was walking back down that aisle on his arm, my legs moving automatically, while my mind tried to catch up with what just happened. His mother was crying again in the front row, but when I looked at her, she looked away fast. His father was already on his phone typing something. The photographer snapped pictures of us smiling, and I realized I was smiling because my face knew what to do at a wedding even when my brain was falling apart. The country club was decorated exactly how Colin and I planned it. White flowers and gold ribbons everywhere. But it felt like walking into a stage set now. The receiving line formed and Christopher positioned himself next to me, his hand settling on my lower back in a spot that felt too familiar, too claiming Colin always touched my upper back or my shoulder, never this low. Christopher's thumb moved in small circles against my dress, and I wanted to step away but couldn't without making a scene. Guests filed past congratulating us, hugging us, and I watched Christopher's parents greeting everyone with these tight, forced smiles. His mother kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue, but I noticed she wasn't actually crying anymore, just going through the motions. His father shook hands and made small talk, but never once looked at me directly, his eyes sliding past mine every time. They knew. They absolutely knew this was Christopher standing here, not Colin, and they weren't surprised at all. My sister Natasha grabbed my arm near the bathrooms after I'd greeted about 50 people. She pulled me aside and leaned in close, her face worried. "Something's really off about Colin today," she whispered. "He's standing different, like more confident or something, and his laugh sounds wrong. Did you notice?" I looked at her and felt something break loose inside me. "I know," I said quietly. "It's not Colin. It's Christopher." Her face went completely white and her fingers dug into my arm hard enough to hurt. "What do you mean it's Christopher? What are you talking about?" I glanced back at the receiving line where Christopher was laughing with someone's aunt. Completely comfortable, like he belonged there. "That's Christopher at our wedding. That's Christopher I just married. Colin isn't here." Natasha started to pull me toward the main room, her jaw set in that way she gets when she's about to cause a scene. "We need to announce this right now. We need to stop this insane situation before it goes any further." I grabbed her hand and held tight. "Wait, I need to understand what happened to Colin first. I need to know where he is and if he's okay before I do anything public." She stared at me like I was crazy. "You just married the wrong person, and you want to wait?" I nodded, my mind racing through possibilities. "Just help me investigate quietly. I'll pretend everything is normal through the reception while we figure out what's going on. Please." She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but if we don't find answers fast, I'm telling everyone." The first dance started and Christopher led me onto the floor while everyone watched and clapped. He pulled me close, closer than Colin ever held me during our dance lessons, his hands spread wide across my back. The music played and we moved together and he leaned down so his mouth was right next to my ear. "I've loved you since Colin first brought you home 7 years ago," he whispered. "I've waited so long for this." His breath on my neck made my skin crawl and I felt sick, actually physically sick. But I kept smiling and moving because there were 200 people watching and cameras everywhere. I forced myself to keep dancing, to keep pretending. While Christopher held me like he owned me and whispered things that made me want to run screaming from the room, I excused myself to the bathroom as soon as the dance ended, practically running across the reception hall. Inside the fancy bathroom with its marble counters and gold fixtures, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called Colin's number. It went straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I tried texting him, asking where he was, if he was okay, if he knew what Christopher did. The messages showed as sent, but nothing delivered. I stared at my phone and felt panic rising in my chest, because Colin was gone and I had no way to reach him, and I just married his brother. Natasha found me 20 minutes later and pulled me into a corner near the bar. "I talked to Antonio Velez," she said quietly. "You remember him? Colin's friend from law school?" I nodded. "Antonio said he thought it was weird that Colin asked him to be a groomsman only 2 weeks ago. They haven't been close in years. He almost said no because it seemed so random." She leaned closer. "All the groomsmen are actually Christopher's friends, not Colin's usual group. I checked with a few of them. They all know Christopher way better than Colin." Dinner started and everyone sat down at their assigned tables. Christopher stood up with his champagne glass and the room got quiet. He started talking about patience and waiting for the right moment, about how some things are worth waiting years for, and his eyes locked on mine the whole time. Several guests shifted in their seats looking uncomfortable. His mother dabbed her eyes again with that tissue, but I watched carefully and saw she wasn't actually crying, just touching the tissue to her face and making sad expressions. The whole thing was a performance. I watched the wedding video playing on screens around the reception, showing our ceremony from different angles. In every shot, Christopher's boutonniere was pinned to the right side of his jacket. I remembered so clearly discussing this with Colin and with Zara Austin, the wedding coordinator left side, because Colin's grandfather always wore it left. We'd talked about it 3 times. Zara had even written it down in her notes. But there it was on the video, clear as anything, pinned to the right side. Another piece of evidence that this was Christopher, not Colin. My friend Elise Massey appeared next to me and pulled me aside toward the hallway. "I saw something weird during cocktail hour," she said, looking worried. So Christopher's father was putting Colin's car keys in his pocket. I know those keys because of that stupid Red Sox keychain Colin always has. When I asked him about it, he said Colin asked him to move the car. But I looked outside and Colin's car isn't even here. I checked the whole parking lot. Minutes later, the DJ announced it was time to cut the cake. Christopher took my hand and led me to the 3-tier white cake with roses made of frosting. Everyone gathered around with their phones up, taking pictures and videos. The photographer positioned us just right. telling us to smile. Christopher picked up the silver cake knife and wrapped his hand around mine on the handle, his palm pressed against the back of my hand, completely dry and steady. Colin's hands were always a little sweaty when he was nervous or excited, especially at big moments like this. I'd held his clammy hands at his law school graduation, at his first day at the firm, at family dinners with his parents. But Christopher's hand was bone dry, confident, not a trace of nerves. We cut into the bottom layer together and everyone clapped. He fed me a small piece and I forced myself to smile while cameras flashed. Every tiny difference between him and Colin felt like another piece of proof that I'd been tricked. I excused myself to find Natasha and spotted her near the coat check room, motioning for me to follow. She pulled me into the small room where all the jackets hung on a long metal rack. She was holding Colin's brown leather wallet in one hand and his phone in the other, both items I recognized instantly. The wallet had a small coffee stain on one corner from when he spilled his drink at a restaurant last year. The phone had a crack across the screen from when he dropped it in our bathroom 3 months ago. Natasha's hands were shaking as she held them out to me. She'd found them in the inside pocket of Christopher's suit jacket, the one hanging with the groomsmen's coats. I took the phone and pressed the power button, but the screen stayed black. Dead battery. Christopher had been carrying Colin's wallet and phone this whole time, which meant he could intercept any calls or texts Colin might get. Anyone trying to reach Colin would think he was ignoring them or had his phone off. I slipped both items into my small wedding purse and we walked back out to the reception. My mother, Rosemary, was standing near the guest book table, running her finger down the pages where people had signed in. She looked up when she saw me and waved me over with a concerned expression. She pointed to Christopher's signature on the guest book, written in his role as best man earlier in the day. The handwriting was completely different from Colin's. Colin was left-handed and his writing always slanted backward in that distinctive way left-handed people write. But this signature was right-handed, slanting forward. The letters formed differently. My mother asked quietly if Colin was feeling okay, if something was wrong with him. I told her we'd talk after the reception, that I couldn't explain right now. She squeezed my hand and nodded, her face full of worry. I saw Natasha near the bar talking to Christopher's father, their body language tense and aggressive. His face was red and he was leaning close to her, speaking in a low voice that looked angry. Natasha's arms were crossed and she was shaking her head. Then she said something back to him and walked away quickly, coming straight to me. Her whole body was trembling with rage when she reached me. Christopher's father had cornered her and warned her not to cause a scene that would embarrass both families. He told her that making a public spectacle would only hurt everyone, especially me. He knew. Christopher's father knew exactly what was happening, knew his son had taken Colin's place at the altar and he wanted it kept quiet. Natasha had told him to go to hell and walked away before she did something she'd regret. The DJ started playing a slow song and couples moved onto the dance floor. Christopher appeared at my side and took my hand, leading me out to dance before I could refuse. He put one hand on my waist and held my other hand up in the traditional slow dance position. Other couples swayed around us, including his parents who were watching us with fake smiles. I looked directly into Christopher's eyes and told him I knew who he was. I demanded to know where Colin was right now, this second. Christopher smiled, not surprised or worried, just calm and satisfied. He said Colin was safe and that I should give this a real chance. He told me he knew me better than Colin ever did, that he'd been paying attention all these years while Colin took me for granted. He listed things about me that were true. Small details like how I always ordered my coffee with extra cream, how I hated surprise parties, how I bit my bottom lip when I was concentrating on work emails. Things he'd learned by watching me too closely for too long. I told him I was going to announce the truth to everyone in this room right now. Christopher kept swaying to the music, his hand firm on my waist. He pointed out calmly that we were legally married now. The marriage certificate had been signed by both of us and the priest and the witnesses. Making a scene wouldn't change that legal fact. He suggested we discuss this privately at home where we could talk without an audience. His voice was so reasonable, so measured, like he'd thought through every single angle of this situation. He'd planned for my anger, for my resistance, for everything. I realized he'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. The song ended and we walked off the dance floor. The reception started winding down over the next hour. Christopher played the perfect groom, shaking hands with departing guests and thanking them for coming. He helped his parents gather their things and hugged relatives goodbye. He stood next to me with his hand on my lower back while we said goodbye to my coworkers and college friends. My family kept shooting me worried looks, but I caught my father's eye and gave a small shake of my head, signaling him to wait. We'd talk privately later when I could explain everything without Christopher listening. The venue staff started clearing tables and the DJ packed up his equipment. Christopher retrieved our coats and helped me into mine like a gentleman. We walked to Colin's car in the parking lot and Christopher unlocked it with Colin's keys he must have taken from the apartment. He opened the passenger door for me and I got in, my wedding dress bunching up around me in the small space. He drove us through the dark streets toward the apartment I'd shared with Colin for 4 years. He knew exactly where to go, which turns to take, where to the park. He'd clearly been to our apartment many times, probably when Colin wasn't home, studying our life together. We rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and he unlocked our apartment door on the first try. He walked in and turned on the lights, moving through the space like he lived there. He hung up his coat on the hook Colin always used. He suggested I change out of my wedding dress and get comfortable so we could talk. I went into the bedroom and locked the door behind me. My hands fumbled with my phone as I dialed 911. The operator answered and asked about my emergency. I tried to explain that someone had impersonated my fiance at my wedding, that I'd just married the wrong person. The operator asked if I was in immediate danger right now. I said no, not exactly. She asked if this was a civil matter about a wedding dispute, like a contract issue. I tried to make her understand that this was identity fraud, that Christopher had pretended to be Colin and tricked everyone. But it sounded crazy even as I said it out loud. The operator kept asking questions about whether I was hurt or threatened, whether I needed police or if this was something for a lawyer. Christopher knocked on the bedroom door, 3 soft taps. He said my name quietly. Then I heard something slide under the door. I walked over and picked it up. Colin's phone. Christopher said through the door that I could check it for proof that Colin knew about the switch. He told me the passcode, which was the same one I'd always known. I pressed the power button and the phone turned on. I entered the code and it unlocked. I went straight to the messages and found a long thread between Colin and Christopher. I scrolled up to 2 weeks ago and started reading. The texts showed Colin having a breakdown about the wedding, saying he wasn't ready and didn't know how to tell me. Christopher responded offering to help, to handle it, to take care of everything. Colin seemed to agree, though the messages were vague and could be read different ways. There were texts from 3 days ago where Colin said he needed time and Christopher said he understood. The last message from Colin said he was sorry and he hoped I'd understand someday. I scrolled up through the message thread, my hands shaking as I read weeks of texts between Colin and Christopher. 2 weeks before the wedding, Colin sent a long message at 2 a.m. saying he couldn't breathe thinking about the ceremony, that he loved me but felt trapped by everyone's expectations. Christopher responded within minutes, asking if Colin wanted help. Colin replied yes, but didn't specify what kind of help. The next messages were vague. Christopher saying he'd handle everything, and Colin just needed to trust him. Colin sent back a thumbs up emoji, which felt wrong because Colin hated emojis. Always said they were lazy communication. I kept scrolling and found messages from 5 days ago where Colin said he needed space to think. Christopher wrote back saying he'd arranged everything, that Colin should go to the cabin and leave his phone behind, so no one could pressure him. Colin agreed, said he'd leave the phone in Christopher's car. The last message from Colin was 3 days ago, just before he must have driven to the cabin. He wrote that he was sorry and hoped I'd understand someday, but he couldn't face me or the wedding. I clicked on the voice memos app and saw one file dated 3 days ago, recorded at 6:47 p.m. My finger hovered over the play button for several seconds before I pressed it. Colin's voice came through the speaker, broken and crying. He said he was so sorry but he couldn't go through with the marriage, that he felt trapped and needed time to figure out what he wanted. His voice cracked when he said my name, said he knew this was cruel, but he couldn't face me at the altar. Background noise filtered through, wind rushing past and the hum of tires on pavement like he was recording from inside a moving car. Someone else was driving because I could hear another person breathing, though they didn't speak. The memo ended after 42 seconds. Colin's last words begging me to forgive him someday. I played it 3 more times, listening for clues about where he was or who was driving. Christopher knocked on the door again, 3 soft taps like before. He said Colin was at their family's cabin upstate, about 3 hours north of the city. He said Colin went willingly, that he wanted space away from me and the wedding pressure. Christopher insisted Colin had asked him to take his place at the altar because he was too afraid to tell me himself. His voice through the door sounded calm and rational, like this whole situation made perfect sense to him. I stood up and walked to the door, my phone still recording everything Christopher said. I unlocked the deadbolt and yanked the door open. Christopher stood in the hallway wearing Colin's favorite gray sweater, the one I'd bought him last Christmas. I held up my phone and told him I'd recorded everything he just said, that I had proof of fraud and identity theft. I demanded the cabin's exact address right now or I was calling the police. Christopher didn't look worried or surprised. He pulled out his phone and texted me the address, a location pin dropping into my messages showing a spot in the Catskills. He said Colin wouldn't see me even if I drove up there because he was too ashamed. He said Colin had made his choice and I should respect it, give him the space he needed. I heard footsteps running up the stairs outside the apartment, then pounding on the front door. Natasha's voice called my name, sharp and worried. I pushed past Christopher and opened the door to find Natasha with my brother Cullen and my father Blake, all 3 of them breathing hard like they'd run from the parking lot. Natasha grabbed my shoulders and asked if I was okay, if Christopher had hurt me. I told them I was fine and pulled them inside, away from Christopher who stood watching from the hallway. We gathered in the living room and I played them Colin's voice memo, watching their faces change as they heard him crying and apologizing. I showed them the text messages, the vague planning between Colin and Christopher, the admission that Colin went to the cabin willingly. Blake's face turned red as he read the messages, his jaw clenching tighter with each screen. Cullen kept shaking his head and muttering that this couldn't be real, that Colin wouldn't do this. Natasha argued that Colin might have been manipulated or coerced, that the messages could be interpreted different ways. Blake said it didn't matter if Colin was manipulated because he still made a choice to abandon me at my own wedding. We debated in circles for 20 minutes, some messages sounding like Colin was a victim and others sounding like he was a coward who took the easy way out. Blake wanted to drive to the cabin immediately, said we should drag Colin back here and make him explain himself in person. I checked my phone and saw it was 11:43 p.m., nearly midnight. The cabin was 3 hours away according to the GPS, which meant we wouldn't arrive until almost 3 a.m. Natasha said we should wait until morning when we'd be calmer and could see clearly, that confronting Colin in the middle of the night while everyone was angry wouldn't help. Blake argued but eventually agreed, said he'd come back at dawn and we'd all drive up together. Natasha said she was staying with me tonight. No arguments. Christopher appeared in the doorway and said he'd sleep on the couch, that he wasn't going anywhere until this was resolved. Blake looked like he wanted to punch him, but Cullen held his arm. Christopher walked to the linen closet and pulled out blankets like he knew exactly where everything was kept, which made my skin crawl. Blake and Cullen left after making me promise to keep my phone on and call if anything happened. Natasha helped me change out of my wedding dress, the silk catching on my rings as I pulled it over my head. She hung it in the closet and I stared at it, this expensive white dress I'd worn to marry the wrong person. We lay in my bed with the door locked, Natasha holding my hand in the dark. I heard Christopher moving around the apartment, opening cabinets in the kitchen, running water in the bathroom. Every sound felt like a violation, like he was claiming space that belonged to Colin and me. The refrigerator opened and closed. The microwave beeped. The couch springs creaked as he settled in. Natasha whispered that she'd installed a recording app on her phone and was documenting everything. I realized Christopher must have been here before, probably many times when Colin wasn't home. He knew where the blankets were, where the coffee filters lived, how the shower handle worked. He'd studied our life together, memorized our routines, prepared for this moment. I didn't sleep at all, just lay there listening to Christopher exist in my space. Around 4 a.m., I heard him get up and walk to the kitchen. The coffee maker started brewing, the smell drifting under the bedroom door. At 6:15 a.m., I couldn't stand it anymore and got up. Natasha woke instantly and followed me out. Christopher stood at the counter making coffee, wearing Colin's navy robe that hung on the bathroom door. He'd made it exactly how I liked it, 2 sugars and a splash of cream, which Colin always got wrong even after 7 years together. He handed me the mug and smiled, said good morning, like this was a normal Sunday. The casual domesticity of it terrified me more than if he'd been angry or threatening. He was acting like we were a couple, like this was our morning routine. Natasha grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the bedroom. My father and Cullen knocked on the door at 6:47 a.m., the sun just starting to rise outside. We gathered our things while Christopher watched from the couch. Still wearing Colin's robe, Blake told him to stay here and not try anything stupid. Christopher nodded and said he'd be here when we got back, completely confident that I'd return to him. Natasha said she was staying to watch Christopher and document anything suspicious. She hugged me hard and whispered to call her every hour. The 3 of us walked to Blake's SUV in the parking lot, the morning air cold and sharp. Nobody spoke as we drove north out of the city, the roads mostly empty this early on a Sunday. Cullen sat in the back staring at his phone, probably texting our mother updates. Blake gripped the steering wheel tight, his knuckles white. I watched the city disappear behind us, replaced by suburbs and then trees. The GPS showed 2 hours and 43 minutes remaining. We drove through small towns still sleeping, past closed diners and empty gas stations. The road climbed into the mountains, winding through forests that grew thicker as we went higher. My phone buzzed with a text from Natasha saying Christopher had showered and was now cooking breakfast in my kitchen. Blake's jaw clenched tighter. The GPS directed us onto smaller roads, then onto a dirt path barely wide enough for the SUV. Trees pressed close on both sides, branches scraping the windows. We rounded a curve and the cabin appeared, small and run down with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Colin's black sedan sat in the dirt driveway, covered in 3 days' worth of yellow pollen. No other cars, no signs of life. We parked behind Colin's car and sat there for a moment, nobody moving. Blake turned off the engine and the silence felt heavy. We got out and walked to the porch, old boards creaking under our feet. I knocked on the door, my hand shaking. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, calling Colin's name. Footsteps inside, slow and hesitant. The door opened and Colin stood there looking exhausted and ashamed, dark circles under his eyes and 3 days of stubble on his face. He wasn't hurt or tied up or held against his will. He just stood there in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, staring at me like he'd been expecting this but hoping it wouldn't happen. My father pushed past me into the cabin. Colin stumbled backward and started crying before anyone said a word. He kept saying sorry over and over, his voice breaking, his hands shaking exactly like they used to when he was nervous. But the apology felt empty because he wouldn't look at me directly. I asked him what happened, and he just kept repeating that he needed time, and Christopher offered a solution. Cullen stood in the doorway blocking Colin's exit while I moved closer. I asked Colin if he planned this with Christopher, or if his brother manipulated him. He wiped his face with his sleeve and said both. Said neither. Said he didn't know anymore. He kept circling back to needing time without explaining what that meant, or why he couldn't just tell me he had doubts. His excuses sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing what to say if we found him. I grabbed his shoulders and made him look at me. I asked if he willingly let Christopher marry me in his place. The question hung there for a long moment before Colin nodded and admitted he knew Christopher would stand in at the ceremony. He said he thought it would just be temporary, just until he figured things out. His voice got quieter when he said he didn't realize Christopher planned to actually consummate the marriage and take over his life completely. The way he said it made me sick because it meant he'd considered some version of this acceptable. He'd weighed his own comfort against my right to know and chosen himself. I stepped back from him and felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with trust. 7 years of my life built on a foundation that never existed. My father moved so fast I barely saw it. He grabbed Colin by his shirt and shoved him against the wall. His fist pulled back and I thought he would actually hit him. Instead, he just held Colin there and called him a coward. He said Colin destroyed his daughter's life because he couldn't have an honest conversation. The words came out harsh and loud, echoing in the small cabin. He said Colin was weak and selfish and didn't deserve me or anyone else. Colin didn't try to defend himself or push my father away. He just stood there taking it, his face red, tears still falling. My father finally let him go and Colin slid down to sit on the floor. Colin pulled our father back before things got worse. The silence after felt heavier than the shouting. Colin looked up at me from the floor and started talking without me asking. He said Christopher has been obsessed with me for years. He'd caught Christopher watching our apartment from across the street multiple times. He'd seen Christopher following me to work and sitting in coffee shops where I had meetings. Colin said he thought keeping Christopher close was safer than cutting him off completely. He made it sound like he was protecting me, but really he was just too weak to confront his brother. He said Christopher got worse after the engagement, asking constant questions about our relationship and our routines. Colin admitted he should have told me, but he didn't want to scare me or cause family drama. Every excuse he gave just proved how little he'd considered my safety or my right to know someone was stalking me. I started searching the cabin while Colin sat there. I pulled open drawers and looked under the bed and checked the closet. In a kitchen cabinet behind some canned food, I found a black notebook. Christopher's name was written inside the front cover in his neat handwriting. The first page had my work schedule from 3 years ago, listing what time I arrived and left each day. The next pages detailed my coffee order, my lunch spots, my gym routine, the route I took home. There were notes about my favorite foods and the books I read on the subway and the friends I met for drinks. He'd documented my relationship patterns with Colin, noting when we fought and when we seemed happy. Some entries included sketches of me sitting in cafes or walking down the street. The dates showed this had been going on since shortly after Colin and I moved in together. This wasn't recent obsession. This was years of planning and watching and waiting. I threw the notebook at Colin and pages scattered across the floor. I asked him if he knew about this, and he said not all of it, not this detailed. But then he admitted he'd told Christopher about our problems over the past few months. He said Christopher asked questions about my mood and our arguments, and Colin answered them because it felt good to talk to someone. He said Christopher offered advice and sympathy, and eventually suggested that maybe Colin wasn't ready for marriage. When Colin mentioned his cold feet, Christopher said he could help, could take his place temporarily. Colin admitted he felt relieved when Christopher made the offer. That relief made him complicit in everything that happened. He wasn't just a victim of his brother's manipulation. He was an active participant who chose the easy way out. I sat down on the couch across from Colin and asked him directly if he wanted to be married to me. The question was simple and deserved a simple answer. Colin looked at the floor and said he loved me. I told him that wasn't what I asked. He said he wasn't sure he was ready for marriage. I asked if 7 years wasn't enough time to figure that out. He said he thought he was ready, but when it got close, he panicked. He kept talking in circles, never giving a straight answer, just more excuses and explanations that meant nothing. His inability to just say yes or no after everything we'd built together was the final proof I needed. This relationship was never as solid as I believed. I'd been in love with the idea of us, while Colin had been uncertain the whole time. We drove back to the city with Colin in the back seat. Nobody spoke for the first hour. The silence felt appropriate because there was nothing left to say that mattered. I watched the trees pass and thought about all the signs I'd missed over 7 years. Every time Colin hesitated or changed the subject when I mentioned future plans, every time he seemed relieved when I was too busy for serious relationship talks, I'd explained it all away as his practical nature, when really it was doubt he never had the courage to voice. Somewhere past the suburbs, I turned around and told Colin he had 24 hours to figure out what he wanted, because I was filing for annulment either way. He nodded without looking at me. I told him I didn't care if he decided he wanted the marriage or not. The choice was mine now, and I was done. He stared out the window, and I realized I wasn't mourning the loss of Colin. I was mourning the person I thought he was, the relationship I thought we had. The real Colin was this weak man who'd rather let his brother steal his life than have a difficult conversation. We dropped Colin at a hotel near his office. He got out without saying goodbye and walked inside with his shoulders hunched. My father drove me back to the apartment and asked if I wanted him to come up. I said no. I needed to handle this myself. The apartment felt different when I walked in, like Christopher's presence had contaminated it. He was gone, but his cologne still hung in the air. I found a note on the kitchen counter in his handwriting. It said he was staying with his parents and hoped I would consider giving him a real chance. The note went on for 2 pages about how well he knew me, listing my favorite things and my habits and my dreams for the future. Every detail was something only someone watching closely would know. He mentioned the book I was reading, the promotion I wanted at work, the vacation spot I'd mentioned to Colin months ago. The note confirmed everything the notebook showed. Christopher had been studying me like a test he planned to ace. I called my mother and asked for the lawyer's number she'd mentioned. She gave it to me along with a warning that this would get complicated and expensive. I didn't care about complicated or expensive anymore. I just wanted out. The lawyer answered on the 3rd ring, and I explained the situation as clearly as I could. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said this was the most unusual case she'd encountered in 20 years of family law. She asked detailed questions about the ceremony and whether I knew it was Christopher at the time. I told her I suspected but went through with it anyway, which might complicate things. She said the marriage might be voidable due to fraud, but we'd need to prove Christopher intentionally deceived me. She asked if I had evidence, and I told her about the notebook and the texts on Colin's phone. She said to bring everything to her office tomorrow and we'd start building the case. Her confidence made me feel slightly less powerless, like maybe I could actually undo what Christopher and Colin had done to me. The lawyer leaned back in her chair and asked if the marriage was consummated, her pen hovering over her legal pad. I felt my stomach turn over as I realized what Christopher had been planning when he tried to get me alone at the apartment that first night. He wanted to sleep with me before my family could intervene, to make the marriage harder to annul, to create another layer of complication that would trap me further. The calculation behind that plan made me physically sick, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I stood over the sink taking deep breaths. When I came back, the lawyer was making notes and told me the lack of consummation would help our case significantly. She scheduled another meeting for later in the week and gave me the detective's contact information at the police station. The next morning, I drove to the police station with the notebook and Colin's phone in a folder on my passenger seat. The detective assigned to my case was a woman in her 40s who looked skeptical when I started explaining about identity fraud at my wedding. She took notes but kept glancing at the clock like she had more important cases waiting. Then I showed her the notebook with Christopher's handwriting, documenting my routines and habits going back 3 years, and her expression changed completely. She put on gloves and started photographing each page, asking me questions about when I first noticed Christopher's behavior and whether I felt unsafe. I showed her Colin's phone with the text messages between the brothers, and she called in another detective to review the evidence with her. They spent an hour going through everything while I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair drinking bad coffee from a machine in the hallway. The detective finally called me back into the interview room and explained this was legally complicated because Colin knew about the switch, and Christopher is his identical twin. She said proving criminal intent would be difficult when the real groom was aware and consented to the substitution, even though I didn't know. But the stalking evidence in the notebook could definitely support harassment charges, and the identity fraud might qualify depending on how the prosecutor's office wanted to handle it. She said she'd submit everything to the district attorney, and someone would contact me about pressing charges. I asked how long that would take, and she said probably a few weeks, which felt like forever when Christopher was still out there thinking he had some claim to me. I got home around noon and found Christopher's parents waiting in the building lobby with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as their attorney. They asked if we could talk privately in my apartment, and I almost said no, but decided I wanted to hear what they had to say. Upstairs, their lawyer pulled out papers for a quiet annulment that wouldn't involve any public record or criminal charges against Christopher. He explained they were prepared to compensate me for my trouble and emotional distress, and all I had to do was sign the agreement and never discuss the matter publicly. Christopher's mother kept dabbing her eyes with a tissue while his father stood by the window looking at his phone, and I realized their main concern was avoiding scandal that would damage their reputation in their country club social circle. I told them I wasn't signing anything, and that Christopher needed to be evaluated by a mental health professional, because his behavior showed clear signs of obsessive disorder. Their lawyer's expression hardened, and he warned me that making this public would hurt my reputation too, that people would question my judgment for going through with the ceremony, even after I suspected something was wrong. He said employers don't like hiring people involved in messy personal scandals, and my marketing career could suffer permanent damage. Christopher's mother started crying for real then, begging me to think about Christopher's future and how a criminal record would ruin his life. I told them to leave, and that they'd hear from my lawyer, and Christopher's father finally looked up from his phone to say I was making a terrible mistake. After they left, I called Natasha and asked her to come over immediately. She arrived within an hour, and I explained about the lawyer's warning that Christopher's family would try to control the story. We spent the afternoon documenting everything on my laptop, uploading photos of the notebook pages to a private cloud account, and writing out a timeline of events with dates and witnesses. Natasha suggested we get ahead of their narrative by posting something simple on social media before they could spin it their way. I drafted a statement saying my wedding ceremony involved identity fraud, and I was pursuing legal action, without naming Christopher or Colin initially. Natasha read it over and said it was direct and factual enough that I couldn't be accused of slander. I posted the statement on my personal accounts at 6 in the evening. Within an hour, my phone started blowing up with notifications and messages. Friends were commenting, asking what happened. Acquaintances from college were sharing the post, and people I barely knew were sending me private messages, asking for details. By midnight, the post had been shared over 1,000 times, and local news reporters were calling my phone asking for interviews. I turned off my phone and tried to sleep, but kept checking my laptop to see the numbers climbing. The next morning, my boss called before I even got to work. She said she'd seen the post and was concerned about the publicity affecting our marketing firm's professional image. I could hear the worry in her voice about clients questioning whether they wanted to be associated with someone involved in this kind of scandal. I told her I understood, and would keep my personal situation separate from work, but I realized my career might have consequences I hadn't thought through when I decided to make this public. Colin called my cell phone that afternoon, the first time I'd heard from him since we dropped him at the hotel. His voice was shaking when he begged me not to destroy Christopher's life over this, saying his brother was mentally ill and needed help, not prosecution. I told Colin he was still protecting Christopher, instead of taking responsibility for his own role in letting this happen. He started crying and said he knew he'd made terrible choices, but Christopher was sick, and jail wouldn't help him. I asked Colin why he never told me Christopher was obsessed with me, why he kept bringing his brother around our apartment when he knew Christopher was watching me. Colin admitted he thought keeping Christopher close was better than cutting him off and making the obsession worse, which sounded like the kind of backward logic that got us into this mess. That evening, Antonio called me out of nowhere asking if I was okay after seeing my social media post. We talked for an hour, and he told me something that made everything click into place. Colin had been seeing a therapist for the past year about commitment issues and problems with his family. Antonio knew because Colin had asked him for a therapist recommendation after a particularly bad anxiety attack at work. Colin never told me about any therapy, never mentioned he was struggling with our relationship or his family dynamics. Antonio said the therapist was helping Colin work through his enmeshment with Christopher and their parents' dysfunction, but clearly it wasn't enough to prevent this disaster. I thanked Antonio for telling me and hung up feeling angry that Colin had been dealing with all this in secret, while I planned our wedding thinking everything was fine. 2 days later, the detective called with an update. Christopher had agreed to undergo a psychological evaluation as part of a potential plea deal to avoid criminal charges. The results showed obsessive-compulsive personality disorder with delusional elements, according to the forensic psychologist who examined him. She said Christopher genuinely believed I would eventually accept the situation and see that he was better for me than Colin. The psychologist noted Christopher had been building an elaborate fantasy about our relationship for years, convincing himself that my relationship with Colin was just a mistake I would realize once Christopher showed me how well he understood me. The detective said this diagnosis would support both the harassment charges and the annulment case, proving Christopher wasn't acting rationally when he orchestrated the wedding switch. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. Christopher sat at the defense table wearing a gray suit that made him look smaller than I remembered, his lawyer standing to argue that mandatory mental health treatment would be more helpful than criminal charges. The lawyer talked about Christopher's diagnosis, about how he genuinely believed his actions were showing love rather than causing harm, about how jail wouldn't fix whatever was broken in his brain. I sat with my lawyer at the other table, watching Christopher's hands shake slightly as he stared at the wood grain in front of him, and I realized I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The judge, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, looked at me directly and asked what outcome I was seeking. My lawyer had prepared me for this question, but standing up to answer felt like choosing between revenge and relief. I told the judge I wanted the marriage annulled based on fraud, that I wanted a restraining order keeping Christopher away from me, and that I wanted mandatory treatment with someone checking to make sure he actually went. I said I didn't want him in jail because that wouldn't protect me or fix him, but I needed legal protection from any future contact. My voice stayed steady while I talked, which surprised me because my hands were shaking worse than Christopher's now. The judge wrote notes while I spoke, then asked if I was sure about not pursuing criminal charges, and I said yes because I just wanted this finished. Christopher's lawyer looked relieved, my lawyer looked satisfied, and Christopher finally looked up at me with this confused, hurt expression, like he still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. The judge granted the annulment based on fraudulent identity and issued a 5-year restraining order requiring Christopher to stay 500 feet away from me at all times. She ordered mandatory therapy twice a week with monthly compliance reports sent to the court, and she made it clear that any violation of the restraining order would result in immediate criminal charges. Christopher's parents sat in the back row looking relieved that it wasn't worse, probably grateful their son wasn't going to jail where everyone would know what happened. Christopher kept staring at me with that hurt puppy look that made me want to scream because he was the victim in his own mind somehow. The whole hearing took less than an hour, and then it was over except for signing papers in a side room where the clerk processed the annulment like it was just another Tuesday. Walking out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sun felt wrong, like something this big should happen on a dark, rainy day instead. Colin was waiting on the steps, and I almost walked past him because I'd trained myself not to look for him anymore. He called my name and I stopped, turning to see him looking thinner and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He said he was moving to another city to start over, that he couldn't stay here with all the reminders of what happened. His voice cracked when he apologized again, but then he admitted he wasn't capable of the relationship I deserved, which was probably the most honest thing he'd said to me in months. I didn't cry or yell or ask him to stay. I just nodded and walked to my car while he stood there watching me leave. The next Monday, I returned to work and faced questions from colleagues who'd seen my social media posts about the wedding fraud. Most people were nice about it, asking if I was okay in that careful way people use when they don't want to pry but also really want details. My boss called me into her office mid-morning looking concerned, and she told me she supported me completely, but some clients had mentioned the situation and wondered if it would affect my work. I realized right then that my professional reputation had taken a hit I'd need to rebuild, that people would always remember me as the woman whose wedding turned into a fraud case. She assured me my job was safe and my work was still excellent, but I could hear the unspoken worry about client confidence. I spent the rest of the day responding to emails and avoiding the break room where I knew people were probably talking about me. That weekend, Elise showed up at my apartment with 3 other friends and announced they were throwing me a divorce party, even though it was technically an annulment. They brought wine and takeout and decorations that said things like newly single, which made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Elise gave a toast about how I was the strongest person she knew, and how Christopher and Colin were idiots who didn't deserve me. The others joined in with their own stories about bad relationships and fresh starts, and I felt this warmth in my chest realizing I had people who actually cared about me beyond what I could do for them. We stayed up late talking and laughing, and for a few hours I felt almost normal again. 2 weeks later, I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with Colin into a smaller place across town, in a neighborhood I'd never lived in before. I wanted no reminders of the past 7 years, no familiar coffee shops or grocery stores where we'd shopped together. Packing up our shared belongings felt like digging through a life that never really existed. Every item raising questions about what was real and what was performance. The coffee maker we bought together after his law school graduation. The couch we'd argued about for 3 weekends before finally agreeing. The framed photo from a vacation where I'd thought we were happy. I left most of it for Colin to deal with, taking only what was definitely mine and a few things I couldn't bear to leave behind. Natasha helped me pack boxes while asking if I was sure about leaving so much stuff, and I told her I didn't want anything that reminded me of Colin. The new apartment was smaller, but it was mine alone, and standing in the empty living room with boxes stacked against the walls felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. 3 months after the wedding, I started seeing a therapist recommended by my lawyer who specialized in trauma and trust issues. The first session was awkward. Me trying to explain the situation to someone new who kept nodding like this was normal instead of completely insane. She asked questions about my relationship with Colin, about how I'd missed the red flags, about what I thought I could have done differently. I cried through most of that first hour, which made me angry because I thought I was past crying about this. But she said crying was processing, not weakness, and that I'd missed red flags because I wanted to believe in the relationship, which didn't make me stupid, just human. Over the next few weeks, she helped me understand that trust wasn't something broken in me that needed fixing, but something I'd have to learn to rebuild carefully with people who actually deserved it. Christopher's parents sent a formal apology letter through their lawyer about a month into my therapy. The letter admitted they'd enabled Christopher's obsessive behavior for years and should have gotten him help instead of making excuses. They acknowledged their role in the wedding disaster and took responsibility for not intervening when they saw how unhealthy his fixation on me had become. The letter ended with an offer to pay for my therapy costs, which felt like the least they could do after helping their son commit fraud. I showed the letter to my therapist, who said accepting their money didn't mean forgiving them, just letting them face consequences in a way that actually helped me. I had my lawyer send a response accepting their offer with clear terms about payment going directly to the therapist's office. Part of me wanted to refuse out of pride, but the practical part that had paid bills for 7 years knew therapy was expensive, and they owed me at least this much. I ran into Antonio at a coffee shop near my new apartment one Saturday morning, both of us reaching for the same table by the window. He recognized me first and asked if I was doing okay, his face showing genuine concern rather than nosy curiosity. We sat together and talked for almost an hour, and he told me Colin was doing better in his new city, that he'd finally found a therapist he trusted, and was being honest about his family issues for the first time. Antonio said Colin asked about me sometimes, but understood why I didn't want contact. I listened to all of this and felt nothing, which showed me how completely I'd detached from that relationship. Colin was just someone I used to know now, not the person I'd planned to spend my life with. Antonio seemed relieved I wasn't falling apart, and when we said goodbye outside the coffee shop, I realized I was actually okay, not just pretending for other people, but genuinely starting to rebuild something real. My boss called me into her office 3 weeks after that coffee shop conversation with Antonio, and I walked in expecting another difficult discussion about the publicity around my situation. She closed the door and told me the executive team wanted to promote me to senior marketing director. I sat there confused because I'd assumed the wedding disaster had damaged my professional reputation beyond repair. She explained that the campaign I'd been leading for our biggest client had exceeded every target, bringing in revenue that made the company's quarterly numbers jump significantly. The client specifically requested me for their next campaign, impressed by how I handled pressure and delivered results even while dealing with personal problems. She said the executives saw someone who could manage crisis situations without falling apart, which was exactly what they needed at the senior level. The promotion came with a substantial raise and my own team, turning the worst experience of my life into an unexpected career boost that felt strange to accept. I took the promotion because refusing it wouldn't change what happened, and at least something good could come from all that pain. Natasha invited me to a dinner party at her friend's apartment the following weekend, saying it was time I met people who had nothing to do with my past relationship or the wedding situation. I almost said no out of habit, but then realized I'd been isolating myself for months and needed to start living again. The dinner included 6 of Natasha's college friends, people who knew my story, but treated me normally instead of like someone fragile who might break. We talked about work and travel and stupid reality TV shows, normal conversation that didn't revolve around my trauma. I caught myself laughing at someone's joke about their terrible boss and realized I wasn't constantly scanning the room or checking over my shoulder. The anxiety that someone was watching me had faded enough that I could relax around strangers, which felt like a bigger victory than it probably should have. One of Natasha's friends asked if I was dating anyone, and I said no, but didn't feel defensive about it. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, slowly building confidence that I could read people and situations accurately. The detective called on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing campaign proposals at work. He said Christopher had been fully compliant with his treatment plan and restraining order for the past 4 months, attending therapy twice weekly, and taking prescribed medication without missing doses. The psychologist working with Christopher believed he was making genuine progress in understanding that his behavior had been wrong and harmful. Christopher apparently spent sessions talking about his obsessive patterns and how he'd convinced himself that taking Colin's place was somehow helping me. The detective said the psychologist used words like delusional thinking and obsessive fixation, clinical terms that made Christopher's actions sound like symptoms instead of choices. Part of me wanted to stay angry at Christopher for what he did, but another part felt relieved that he was getting actual help instead of just being punished. The detective asked if I wanted updates on Christopher's progress, and I said yes because knowing he was stable made me feel safer. A letter arrived at my apartment 2 weeks later with a court system forwarding label, and I knew immediately it was from Christopher. I held the envelope for several minutes before opening it, not sure I wanted to read whatever he'd written. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in Christopher's neat script that looked nothing like Colin's messy scrawl. He apologized for deceiving me and acknowledged that his actions were delusional and harmful, using almost the exact words his psychologist probably used in therapy. He wrote that he'd convinced himself he loved me enough to make me happy, but now understood that wasn't love at all, just obsession and control. The letter explained that he was working on understanding why he'd fixated on me instead of building his own relationships, facing the jealousy he'd always felt toward Colin. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wouldn't contact me again after this one letter. The writing sounded more clear and logical than anything Christopher had said during the wedding or after, suggesting the medication and therapy were actually working. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not ready to forgive but able to acknowledge that he was trying to get better. My mother called in early November to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner at their house, the first major family gathering since the wedding disaster. I hesitated because facing everyone together felt overwhelming, but she said it would just be immediate family, and they all wanted to see me. Thanksgiving Day arrived cold and clear, and I drove to my parents' house feeling nervous about sitting around a table with people who'd witnessed my humiliation. But when I walked in, Cullen immediately hugged me and made a joke about how he was going to personally vet any future boyfriends I brought home, which made everyone laugh, including me. We sat around the table eating turkey and stuffing, talking about normal family things like my promotion and my father's retirement plans. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy instead of just going through motions. My mother squeezed my hand during dessert and told me she was proud of how I'd handled everything, and I realized my family had supported me through the worst experience of my life without judgment. The evening felt like reclaiming something Christopher had tried to take from me, the ability to be surrounded by people who loved me without feeling broken. I started volunteering with a legal aid organization the week after Thanksgiving, answering their call for people with experience in identity fraud and stalking situations. The intake coordinator interviewed me about my background and seemed impressed that I understood both the legal and emotional aspects of these cases. They assigned me to help clients navigate restraining orders and fraud documentation, using my experience to guide others through similar situations. My first client was a woman whose ex-boyfriend had been impersonating her online, and I helped her organize evidence and prepare for her court hearing. Turning my trauma into advocacy work gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't expected, making the whole nightmare feel less pointless. Each person I helped felt like taking back power from what Christopher did, proving that his actions couldn't destroy me completely. The 1-year anniversary of the wedding passed in early spring, and I spent the day at work instead of dwelling on what happened. I was in a much better place professionally with my team running 3 major campaigns, and emotionally I'd rebuilt enough confidence to start dating casually. Nothing serious had developed because I was still learning to trust people, but I'd gone on dates with a few men who seemed decent and patient. Being okay with staying single felt like growth, learning to be complete on my own instead of needing someone else to feel whole. My therapist said I'd done remarkable work processing the trauma, and while I'd always carry some scars, I was functioning well and building a life I actually wanted. Elise called me one afternoon in late spring to tell me she'd seen Colin at a restaurant downtown with a new girlfriend. She said he looked happy but also more mature and self-aware, like he'd finally grown up and faced his issues. I listened to her description and realized I felt nothing. No anger or sadness or jealousy. Colin was just someone I used to know, not the person I'd planned to spend my life with. The fact that I could hear about his life without any emotional reaction proved I'd truly moved on, that the relationship was completely in my past. Elise asked if I was okay, and I told her honestly that I was, which surprised both of us. I bought my own condo in June using savings I'd kept separate from Colin throughout our relationship. The place was small but entirely mine. A top-floor unit with big windows and no shared history with anyone. Decorating it felt like building a new identity separate from the person I'd been during that 7-year relationship. I picked furniture I actually liked instead of compromising, painted walls colors Colin would have hated, and created a space that reflected who I was becoming. Every decision about the condo was mine alone, which felt powerful and right. Natasha called me in early July, her voice excited and nervous at the same time. She told me her boyfriend had proposed, and she wanted me to be her maid of honor. I said yes immediately, genuinely happy for her without any bitterness about my own failed wedding. Standing up at her wedding would feel like reclaiming something Christopher tried to steal from me. Taking back the joy that weddings should represent Natasha's engagement reminded me that not everything about weddings was tainted, that love and commitment could still be real and beautiful when built on honesty. 2 years passed, and I barely recognized the person I'd become in the best possible way. My team at work expanded to 12 people after we landed 3 major accounts in 6 months, and my boss started asking me to present at company meetings because clients responded well to my confidence. I bought better furniture for my condo and hung art I actually liked instead of the safe, neutral stuff Colin preferred. Natasha and I started a monthly dinner tradition where we tried new restaurants and laughed about dating disasters. Mine included because I'd started seeing people again. The first few dates were terrible. Guys who talked too much or didn't listen, or made me feel like I needed to perform some version of myself. Then I met someone at a work conference who asked good questions and remembered my answers, who didn't push when I said I needed to take things slow. We'd been dating for 4 months, and he knew about Christopher and Colin because I told him early, laying it all out to see if he'd run. He didn't run, just said that sounded really hard and asked what I needed from him to feel safe. That question alone told me he was different from anyone I'd dated before. We went to movies and tried cooking together, and he never complained when I checked in about plans or asked for space when I felt overwhelmed. My therapist said I was doing remarkable work, recognizing healthy relationship patterns, that my picker wasn't broken, just learning new settings. I still had bad days where I checked over my shoulder, or felt suspicious of kind gestures, but those days came less often now. Christopher stayed away completely. His parents sent yearly updates through lawyers confirming his treatment compliance, and Colin never contacted me after moving, which felt like the right choice for both of us. I realized one morning while making coffee in my sunny kitchen that what they did to me was horrible and violating and changed me permanently, but it also destroyed a relationship that was never as strong as I believed. 7 years with Colin taught me what I didn't want, what settling looked like, what ignoring my instincts cost me. Building this new life based on honesty and self-respect felt harder, but more real than anything I had before. I carried scars from that wedding day and probably always would. Moments when trust felt impossible or love felt dangerous. But I also carried strength I didn't know I had, boundaries I'd learned to defend, instincts I'd learned to trust again. Looking at my reflection now, I saw someone genuinely happy with who she'd become. Someone who survived something terrible and came out whole on the other side.